They called her Princess at Nellis Air Force Base, a mocking nickname for Captain Sarah Viper Mitchell, the female pilot who supposedly got her wings through diversity quotas rather than skill. The seasoned male pilots had no idea they were dismissing one of the most decorated test pilots in Air Force history, or that her forgotten expertise would be the only thing standing between a crippled aircraft and certain death when Hurricane Delilah turned a routine training mission into the most dangerous landing attempt in military aviation. The morning sun cast long shadows across the flight line at Nellis Air Force Base in Nevada as Captain Sarah Mitchell walked toward the briefing room, her flight suit crisp and her helmet bag slung over her shoulder. At 29, she had the lean build of someone who spent countless hours in the cockpit, but her movements carried a precision that spoke of thousands of flight hours under conditions most pilots would never experience. The other pilots barely acknowledged her presence as she passed, their conversations continuing without the usual nod of professional recognition that aviators typically shared. Sarah had been assigned to the 64th Aggressor Squadron for the past 18 months, officially listed as a recent graduate from pilot training who had been fast-tracked through the F-16 qualification course. Her personnel file showed a standard progression through undergraduate pilot training at Columbus Air Force Base, followed by fighter training at Luke Air Force Base, then assignment to Nellis for advanced tactical training. It was a plausible career path that explained her presence without inviting scrutiny into the classified operations that had actually shaped her flying skills. The briefing room buzzed with the familiar sounds of pilots preparing for another day of red flag exercises. The large-scale training missions that brought together air forces from around the world to practice complex combat scenarios. Maps covered the walls showing the Nevada Test and Training Range, an area larger than some small countries where military aircraft could engage in realistic combat training without civilian interference. The scale of operations at Nellis was immense, with hundreds of sorties flown daily by fighters, bombers, and support aircraft from multiple nations. Major Rick Hammer Davidson, the squadron's operations officer, stood at the front of the room reviewing the day's mission parameters. At 38, Davidson was a veteran of 3 combat deployments with over 2,000 hours in the F-16. His weathered flight suit bore patches from previous assignments, each one representing tours in places where air-to-air combat was a daily reality rather than a training exercise. He commanded respect through a combination of experience and the kind of aggressive flying that had earned him his call sign during operations over Iraq. Today's red flag mission involves a deep strike package against heavily defended targets, Davidson announced, pointing to locations marked on the large tactical display. We'll be flying as the Blue Force, conducting suppression of enemy air defenses while escorting strike aircraft to their objectives. Opposition forces include advanced surface-to-air missile systems and aggressor aircraft simulating enemy fighters. Captain Jake Venom Rodriguez raised his hand from the front row, his perfectly pressed flight suit and polished boots, marking him as someone who took great pride in military appearance. At 26, Rodriguez was the squadron's newest pilot after Sarah, but unlike her, he had quickly established himself within the informal hierarchy that governed fighter pilot culture. His background included family connections to senior Air Force leadership, a fact that hadn't gone unnoticed by his peers or superiors. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this content, please subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss our latest videos. Sir, what's the weather forecast for the training area? Rodriguez asked, though his question seemed more about establishing his presence in the briefing than genuine concern about meteorological conditions. Davidson consulted his notes. Clear skies, light winds, perfect flying weather. However, there's a developing storm system in the Gulf of Mexico that weather forecasters are monitoring. Hurricane Delilah formed overnight and is currently tracking northward, but it's not expected to impact Nevada operations. Sarah listened to the briefing with the quiet attention she had cultivated over her months at Nellis. She had learned that speaking up during mission planning often drew unwanted attention, particularly from pilots who viewed her presence as a political statement rather than operational necessity. Her strategy had been to demonstrate competence through actions rather than words, completing assigned missions with technical precision while avoiding the kind of aggressive maneuvering that might draw criticism or praise in equal measure. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Thunder Williams entered the briefing room, his presence immediately commanding attention from the assembled pilots. At 42, Williams was the squadron commander, a position he had earned through a combination of exceptional flying skills and proven leadership in combat operations. His flight suit bore the subdued patches of special operations units, though. The specific details of those assignments remained classified even within the close-knit fighter community. "Ladies and gentlemen," Williams began, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to making life-and-death decisions under pressure. "Today's red flag exercise has been modified to include a special scenario. Intelligence indicates that enemy forces have developed new electronic warfare capabilities designed to disrupt our communications and navigation systems." The pilots straightened in their seats, recognizing that Williams was describing scenarios based on actual threat developments rather than theoretical training objectives. Red flag exercises were known for their realism, but when squadron commanders spoke about intelligence-based modifications, it usually meant that recent combat operations had revealed new enemy capabilities that needed to be incorporated into training immediately. "Captain Mitchell," Williams continued, his gaze settling on Sarah with an expression that seemed to carry additional meaning, "you'll be flying as Viper 4 in the strike package. Your mission is to provide electronic attack support using the F-16's jamming capabilities while maintaining formation discipline with the primary strike aircraft." Sarah nodded once, acknowledging the assignment without the verbal response that might invite follow-up questions. Electronic attack missions required precise coordination between multiple aircraft operating in close proximity while simultaneously managing complex electronic warfare systems. It was a challenging assignment that demanded both technical expertise and the kind of situational awareness that came from extensive experience with electronic combat systems. Captain Tom Blade Harrison, seated 2 rows behind Sarah, leaned forward with a comment that carried clearly across the quiet briefing room. "Hope Princess can handle the electronic warfare systems without getting confused by all those buttons and switches." His tone was casual, almost conversational, but the underlying mockery was unmistakable to everyone present. Several pilots chuckled quietly at Harrison's remark, though their laughter stopped when Williams fixed them with a steady stare that conveyed his disapproval, without the need for verbal correction. The squadron commander's reputation for maintaining professional standards was well established, but the informal culture of fighter aviation often operated according to different rules than official military protocol. "Captain Harrison," Williams said evenly, "perhaps you'd like to volunteer for the electronic attack mission instead. I'm sure Captain Mitchell would be happy to let you demonstrate your superior understanding of jamming systems." Harrison's confident expression flickered slightly as he realized he had drawn unwanted attention from the squadron commander. Electronic warfare missions were notoriously complex, requiring pilots to manage multiple systems simultaneously while maintaining precise navigation and formation flying. Most pilots preferred air-to-air combat missions where the objectives were more straightforward and the equipment less complicated. "No, sir," Harrison replied quickly. "I'm sure Captain Mitchell can handle the assignment." Williams nodded once, his expression making it clear that further commentary would not be welcome. "The weather briefing indicates favorable conditions throughout the training area, but I want all pilots to remain aware of changing conditions. Hurricane season can produce rapidly developing situations that affect flight operations even at our distance from coastal areas. The meteorological officer, a young lieutenant with the earnest demeanor of someone new to military aviation, stepped forward to provide detailed weather information. Current conditions show clear skies and light winds throughout the Nevada test and training range. However, Hurricane Delilah in the Gulf of Mexico has intensified overnight to Category 2 strength and is tracking northward at approximately 15 miles per hour. Sarah found herself paying closer attention to the weather briefing than the tactical information, her mind automatically processing wind patterns and atmospheric conditions with the instinctive analysis of someone who had flown through weather systems that would ground most civilian aircraft. Hurricanes created complex atmospheric disturbances that could affect flight operations thousands of miles from the storm's center, particularly for aircraft operating at high altitudes where jet streams and upper atmosphere winds could change rapidly. The storm is currently located approximately 800 miles southeast of the Louisiana coast. The meteorologist continued and is expected to make landfall within the next 36 hours. While this system poses no direct threat to Nevada operations, pilots should be aware that upper-level winds may be affected by the storm circulation pattern. Major Davidson resumed control of the briefing, outlining specific mission parameters and engagement rules that would govern the day's training exercise. Red flag missions were structured to simulate realistic combat scenarios, with opposing forces equipped with systems that closely replicated actual enemy capabilities. The exercises pushed pilots and aircraft to their operational limits, creating the kind of high-stress environment that revealed both strengths and weaknesses in training and equipment. Takeoff is scheduled for 0900 hours, Davidson announced, with mission duration approximately 2 hours. All aircraft will return to Nellis unless emergency conditions dictate diversion to alternate airfields. Maintenance has reported all assigned aircraft are mission capable, so we shouldn't experience any equipment-related delays. As the formal briefing concluded, pilots began gathering their materials and preparing for individual aircraft preparation. Sarah collected her notes and charts, organizing them in the methodical way that had become second nature over years of complex mission planning. Her approach to flight preparation was more thorough than most of her peers required, reflecting training that had emphasized redundant planning and contingency preparation beyond standard Air Force protocols. Captain Rodriguez approached her as she prepared to leave the briefing room, his expression carrying the kind of friendly concern that often preceded unwelcome advice or commentary. "Hey, Princess," he said, using the nickname that had apparently stuck despite her obvious discomfort with it. "Just wanted to make sure you're feeling confident about the electronic warfare mission today." Sarah met his gaze directly, recognizing the patronizing tone beneath his apparent concern. "I'm prepared for the mission, Captain Rodriguez. The F-16's ALQ-131 jamming pod is relatively straightforward to operate." Rodriguez nodded, though his expression suggested he found her confidence either admirable or misguided. "Just remember, electronic attack missions can get pretty complex. When you're dealing with multiple threat systems simultaneously, don't hesitate to call for backup if things get overwhelming." The comment stung because it revealed the underlying assumptions that governed how her squadron mates viewed her capabilities. Despite completing every assigned mission successfully over her 18 months at Nellis, she was still seen as someone who might need assistance or guidance from male pilots with supposedly superior experience and judgment. "I appreciate your concern," she replied neutrally, neither accepting nor rejecting his offer of assistance. "But I'm confident in my ability to complete the assigned mission." As Rodriguez walked away, Sarah noticed Captain Harrison watching their exchange with obvious amusement. His earlier comment about Princess handling complex systems had clearly been part of a broader pattern of skepticism about her abilities. Skepticism that seemed immune to evidence of her actual performance in training and mission execution. the equipment room where pilots collected their survival gear and flight. Equipment buzzed with the familiar sounds of mission preparation. G-suits were checked for proper inflation, helmets tested for communication clarity, and survival radios verified for battery life and frequency settings. These preparations had been repeated thousands of times by each pilot, but the routine never became truly automatic because a single equipment failure could mean the difference between a successful mission and a catastrophic outcome. Sarah moved through her equipment check with the same methodical precision she applied to all aspects of flight operations. Her survival vest contained the standard complement of emergency equipment: flares, water, first aid supplies, and a beacon that could transmit her location to search and rescue forces. But unlike her squadron mates, she also carried additional items that weren't part of standard issue: a backup GPS unit, extra batteries for her radios, and emergency medical supplies that exceeded normal requirements. Major Davidson noticed her thorough equipment preparation as he conducted his own gear check at a nearby station. "Planning for a longer mission than briefed, Captain Mitchell?" he asked, though his tone seemed more curious than critical. "Just ensuring I'm prepared for contingencies, sir," Sarah replied, continuing her systematic inspection of each piece of equipment. "Weather can change rapidly, and I prefer to have backup systems available." Davidson nodded approvingly. "Good thinking. Some of our newer pilots could learn from that approach." His comment seemed directed toward the general preparation standards of the squadron rather than specifically at Sarah, but she caught the implication that her thoroughness was noteworthy among her peers. The flight line at Nellis stretched for miles, filled with aircraft representing the cutting edge of military aviation technology. F-16 Fighting Falcons sat alongside F-15 Eagles, A-10 Thunderbolts, and various support aircraft that made red flag exercises possible. Ground crews worked with practiced efficiency, conducting final inspections and loading the specialized equipment that would allow each aircraft to fulfill its mission requirements. Sarah's assigned F-16, tail number 870257, sat in its designated parking spot with external fuel tanks and an electronic jamming pod mounted beneath its wings. The aircraft represented decades of continuous development and improvement, evolution from the original lightweight fighter concept into a multi-role platform capable of air-to-air combat, ground attack, and electronic warfare missions with equal effectiveness. Staff Sergeant Maria Santos, the crew chief responsible for aircraft 870257, approached as Sarah began her pre-flight inspection. Santos had maintained F-16s for over 12 years, and her expertise with the aircraft systems exceeded that of many pilots who flew them. Her weathered hands and grease-stained flight suit spoke of countless hours spent ensuring that complex mechanical systems functioned flawlessly under the extreme conditions of military aviation. "Morning, Captain Mitchell," Santos said, handing Sarah the aircraft maintenance forms that documented all work performed since the previous flight. "She's running perfectly today. All systems checked good, and the jamming pod was just calibrated yesterday." Sarah accepted the forms, scanning them quickly but thoroughly for any discrepancies or maintenance issues that might affect the mission. Her approach to aircraft inspection was more detailed than most pilots required, reflecting an understanding that mechanical reliability often determined mission success more than pilot skill or tactics. "Any issues with the electronic warfare systems?" Sarah asked, running her hand along the jamming pod's antenna array to check for physical damage or loose connections. Santos shook her head. "All electronic systems are functioning normally. The pod's been tested against the full spectrum of threat frequencies, and all parameters are within specifications." As Sarah continued her inspection, walking around the aircraft to examine control surfaces, landing gear, and engine intake, she maintained the quiet focus that had characterized her approach to flying since arriving at Nellis. Her pre-flight procedures were more comprehensive than squadron standards required. But she had learned that thoroughness and preparation often prevented problems that could compromise missions or endanger lives. The morning air carried the distinctive smell of jet fuel and hydraulic fluid that defined military aviation, scents that had become as familiar to Sarah as her own reflection. Around her, other pilots conducted their own aircraft inspections with varying degrees of attention to detail, some rushing through checklist items, while others took time to examine systems carefully. Captain Harrison's F-16 was parked 3 spaces away, and Sarah could hear him joking with his crew chief about the day's mission objectives. Just another day of showing the new guys how real pilots handle complex scenarios, Harrison said loudly enough for nearby pilots to hear. Some people need extra practice with electronic systems, but the rest of us can handle multiple tasks simultaneously. The comment was clearly directed at Sarah, though Harrison maintained the pretense of speaking generally about pilot capabilities. His crew chief, a young airman who seemed uncomfortable with the conversation's direction, focused intently on his maintenance paperwork rather than engaging with Harrison's commentary. Sarah ignored the obvious provocation, continuing her aircraft inspection with the same systematic approach she had used for every flight. Her strategy of avoiding confrontation had served her well during her time at Nellis, though it sometimes required considerable self-control when faced with comments that questioned her competence or commitment to the mission. The pre-flight briefing for individual flights brought together the 4 pilots who would fly as a coordinated element during the day's red flag exercise. Sarah joined Major Davidson, Captain Rodriguez, and Captain Harrison in a small room adjacent to the main briefing area, where they would coordinate their specific tactics and procedures for the electronic attack mission. Davidson spread tactical charts across the table, showing the planned route to their target area and the expected locations of simulated enemy air defense systems. Our job is to suppress enemy radar systems long enough for the strike package to reach their targets and complete their bombing runs, he explained, tracing flight paths with his finger. The mission required precise timing and coordination between multiple aircraft operating in close formation while managing complex electronic warfare systems. Each pilot would be responsible for jamming specific radar frequencies while maintaining formation integrity and defending against simulated enemy fighter attacks. Captain Mitchell, Davidson continued, your jamming pod will focus on the SS-6 and SA-8 surface-to-air missile systems that intelligence indicates are defending the target area. These systems operate in the I and J bands, and your equipment should be able to degrade their tracking capability significantly. Sarah nodded, already familiar with the jamming pod's capabilities against those specific threat systems. Electronic warfare was as much art as science, requiring pilots to understand not just their own equipment, but also the enemy systems they were trying to defeat. What's our contingency if the jamming isn't effective? She asked, recognizing that electronic warfare often produced unpredictable results when different systems interacted in complex electromagnetic environments. Davidson's expression showed approval for the question. If jamming proves ineffective, we'll coordinate with the Wild Weasel aircraft to physically attack the radar sites using HARM missiles. Your job would be to continue jamming while providing targeting information for the missile shots. As the pilots completed their coordination and prepared to walk to their aircraft, Davidson pulled Sarah aside for a brief private conversation. His expression was serious, carrying the weight of command decisions that affected both mission success and pilot safety. Captain Mitchell, he said quietly, I want you to know that I selected you for this mission based on your performance record, not politics or diversity requirements. Some people in this squadron seem to think otherwise, but your flying speaks for itself. Sarah appreciated the support, though she wondered what Davidson knew about her background that others didn't. His confidence in her abilities seemed based on more than just the standard training missions she had flown at Nellis. Thank you, sir, she replied. I won't let the team down." Davidson studied her for a moment, his expression suggesting he was weighing whether to say something additional. Finally, he nodded once and turned toward the door. "I know you won't, Captain. Now let's go show these red flag participants how electronic warfare is supposed to work." The crew chiefs had positioned the four F-16s in perfect formation on the taxiway, their gray camouflage paint schemes gleaming under the Nevada sun as the pilots completed their final cockpit preparations. Sarah strapped herself into the ejection seat of aircraft 870257, running through the complex startup procedures that would bring 30,000 pounds of advanced fighter aircraft to life. The familiar ritual of switch positions, system checks, and radio communications provided a comforting routine that masked the underlying tension she felt whenever flying with pilots who questioned her abilities. "Viper flight, check in, Major." Davidson's voice crackled through her headset as he initiated the standard communication check that preceded every formation takeoff. Each pilot responded in sequence, confirming that their radios were functioning properly and that they were prepared for the mission ahead. "Viper 2, Rodriguez replied, his voice carrying the confident tone that characterized most of his communications. As the flight's wingman, his primary responsibility would be maintaining precise formation position while backing up Davidson's tactical decisions throughout the mission. "Viper 3, Harrison added, unable to completely mask the competitive edge that seemed to color all his interactions with fellow pilots. His position in the formation placed him as Sarah's element leader, a role that required coordination and mutual support that seemed unlikely given his obvious skepticism about her capabilities. "Viper 4, Sarah responded, keeping her voice professionally neutral despite the knowledge that Harrison would be evaluating her every move during the flight. Her position as the formation's most junior pilot meant that any mistakes or hesitation would be immediately noticed and likely discussed in the debrief session that followed every mission. The engine startup sequence required careful attention to temperature and pressure readings as the General Electric F110 turbofan engine spooled up to idle power. Sarah monitored each parameter carefully, noting that all systems were operating within normal ranges as the massive engine reached stable operation. The sound of 4 F-16 engines running simultaneously created a distinctive harmonic that every fighter pilot recognized, a mechanical symphony that represented the culmination of decades of aerospace engineering advancement. Ground control cleared. Viper flight to taxi from their parking area toward the active runway, beginning a carefully choreographed movement that would position them for takeoff at precisely the scheduled time. Nellis operated with clockwork precision during red flag exercises, with dozens of aircraft launching and recovering according to strict timelines that coordinated the complex training scenarios. "Viper flight, tower, taxi to runway 21 left. Hold short," the air traffic controller directed, his voice carrying the professional efficiency that characterized military aviation communication. The tower controllers at Nellis managed some of the most complex flight operations in the world, coordinating military aircraft from multiple nations, operating in the same airspace while maintaining safety margins that allowed for the aggressive maneuvering that combat training required. As the formation taxied toward the runway, Sarah noticed Harrison turning in his cockpit to observe her aircraft handling during the ground operations. His scrutiny felt deliberate and judgmental, as if he were looking for evidence to support his preconceived notions about her flying abilities. She maintained precise position behind Davidson's aircraft, demonstrating the kind of formation discipline that required constant attention to throttle settings and steering inputs. The runway at Nellis stretched for over 14,000 feet, more than adequate for the F-16's takeoff requirements, even with full fuel loads and external equipment. Sarah could see heat shimmer rising from the concrete surface, indicating the kind of desert temperatures that affected aircraft performance and required careful consideration during takeoff calculations. The combination of high temperature and altitude at Nellis meant that aircraft engines produced less thrust than they would at sea level, requiring longer takeoff rolls and more careful attention to performance limitations. Viper Flight Tower, cleared for takeoff runway 21 left, winds calm. Came the clearance that would begin their mission in earnest. Davidson advanced his throttle smoothly, his F-16 beginning its takeoff roll with the controlled acceleration that characterized professional military flying. Rodriguez followed 18 seconds later, maintaining the precise timing that would position the formation correctly for their planned mission profile. Harrison's aircraft began its takeoff roll with what appeared to be unnecessarily aggressive throttle movement, his F-16 accelerating more rapidly than standard procedures required. Sarah recognized the display as typical of pilots who felt the need to demonstrate their superior handling of aircraft systems, though such showmanship often created more problems than it solved in formation flying. When her turn came, Sarah advanced her throttle with the smooth, steady movement that had been drilled into her through hundreds of hours of flight training. Her F-16 accelerated down the runway with mechanical precision, reaching rotation speed at exactly the calculated point based on aircraft weight, temperature, and atmospheric conditions. The aircraft lifted off smoothly, climbing at the optimal angle that balanced performance with formation requirements. The 4 F-16s formed up in standard tactical formation as they climbed toward their assigned altitude, each aircraft positioned to provide mutual support while maintaining separation adequate for defensive maneuvering if required. Sarah concentrated on maintaining precise position relative to Harrison's aircraft, knowing that any deviation from standard formation parameters would likely draw criticism during the post-mission debrief. Viper Flight, Contact Departure Control 124.75. Tower instructed as they passed through 3,000 feet altitude. The handoff to departure control began the transition from local airport operations to the broader air traffic management system that would guide them toward the Nevada test and training range. Departure control, Viper flight of 4 F-16s, climbing to flight level 250, Davidson reported, using the standard phraseology that identified their aircraft type, formation size, and intended altitude. The air traffic system around Nellis was specifically designed to handle military formation flights operating at high speeds and altitudes that would be impossible in civilian airspace. As they climbed through 15,000 feet, Sarah began configuring her electronic warfare systems for the jamming mission that would be their primary responsibility once they reached the training area. The ALP-131 jamming pod carried sophisticated equipment capable of disrupting enemy radar systems across multiple frequency bands, but its effective employment required careful coordination with other aircraft and precise understanding of the electromagnetic environment they would be operating in. Viper 4, how's your jamming pod looking? Harrison's voice came through the radio, though his tone suggested the question was more about checking her competence than genuine concern about equipment status. The timing of his inquiry, just as she was beginning her system checks, seemed calculated to test whether she could manage multiple tasks simultaneously. All systems nominal, Viper 3, Sarah replied calmly, not allowing any irritation to color her response despite the obvious nature of Harrison's test. Her electronic warfare equipment was functioning perfectly, with all frequency bands available and power output readings within specifications. Good to hear, Princess, Harrison responded, using the nickname that had apparently become his standard way of addressing her. Make sure you don't get confused by all those switches and dials when we start the actual jamming. Davidson's voice cut through the formation frequency with unmistakable authority. Viper 3, maintain radio discipline. Save the commentary for the debrief. The squadron commander's intervention was swift and decisive, establishing that unprofessional communication would not be tolerated regardless of the informal culture that often governed Fighter-pilot interactions. Sarah appreciated Davidson's support, though she recognized that Harrison's behavior reflected broader attitudes within the squadron that wouldn't be changed by official correction. The challenge she faced was proving her competence convincingly enough to overcome prejudices that seemed immune to evidence of her actual performance. The Nevada test and training range stretched endlessly below them as they reached their assigned altitude and began the transit toward their target area. The landscape was a mixture of desert, mountains, and specially constructed facilities designed to simulate enemy installations and provide realistic training targets for military aircraft. Sarah had flown over this terrain dozens of times during her assignment to Nellis, but she never tired of the stark beauty of the high desert environment. Viper flight. Contact Magic on frequency 257.8. Departure control instructed, handing them off to the specialized controllers who managed training missions within the restricted airspace of the range. Magic was the call sign for the airborne warning and control system aircraft that provided overall coordination for red flag exercises, tracking both friendly and opposing forces throughout the complex scenarios. Magic, Viper flight checking, 4 F-16S at flight level 250, inbound for jamming mission. Davidson reported to the AWACS controller, whose aircraft was orbiting at high altitude somewhere over the training range. The E-3 Sentry aircraft carried sophisticated radar systems that could track dozens of aircraft simultaneously while coordinating the complex interactions between friendly and opposing forces. Viper flight, Magic, Roger, contact, be advised you have multiple bogies bearing 090 at 40 miles, altitude unknown. Currently maneuvering toward your target area, the controller replied, providing the first indication that opposing forces were already positioning themselves to intercept the strike package. Sarah felt her pulse quicken slightly at the mention of enemy aircraft, though she reminded herself that these were friendly pilots flying in an opposing role rather than actual hostile forces. Red flag exercises were designed to simulate combat conditions as realistically as possible, and the aggressor pilots were trained to employ tactics and techniques that replicated actual enemy capabilities. Viper 3 and 4, spread formation. For defensive positioning, Davidson ordered, recognizing that the approaching aircraft represented a potential threat to their mission success. Electronic warfare aircraft were high-value targets for enemy fighters, and their survival often depended on maintaining formation discipline while employing defensive tactics. Harrison's aircraft moved smoothly to a position that would allow him to defend against attacks from the most likely threat directions, his earlier showmanship replaced by the professional competence that had earned him his position in the squadron. Sarah adjusted her own position to maintain proper separation, while ensuring that her jamming equipment would have clear lines of sight to the target area when they began their electronic attack mission. The target area appeared on the horizon as a collection of simulated missile sites and radar installations positioned throughout a valley between two mountain ridges. Intelligence briefings had indicated that the facilities represented a heavily defended strategic target that would require suppression of air defenses before strike aircraft could successfully attack their primary objectives. Viper flight begin. Electronic attack in 30 seconds, Davidson announced, initiating the sequence that would activate their jamming equipment and begin the complex process of disrupting enemy radar systems. Sarah's fingers moved across her control panel with practiced efficiency, configuring her jamming pod for the specific radar frequencies that intelligence had identified as threats to the incoming strike package. The LQ-131 pod came to life with a subtle vibration that she could feel through the aircraft structure, its powerful transmitters beginning to broadcast electromagnetic energy designed to confuse and degrade enemy tracking radars. Sarah monitored the system's performance carefully, noting that power output was steady and that the pod was cycling through its programmed frequency patterns according to plan. Viper 4, Are you getting good jamming effectiveness against the F-16 sites? Davidson asked, his question reflecting the kind of tactical coordination that made formation flying effective against sophisticated air defense systems. Sarah checked her equipment readings, noting strong electromagnetic returns. That indicated her jamming signals were reaching their intended targets. Affirmative, Viper lead, showing good burn-through on all targeted frequencies, she reported, using the technical terminology that describes successful jamming operations. Outstanding, Davidson replied, though Sarah noticed that Harrison had turned in his cockpit to observe her equipment management during the electronic attack phase of the mission. His scrutiny continued to feel judgmental rather than supportive, as if he were looking for evidence of mistakes or confusion that would validate his skeptical assessment of her capabilities. The formation maintained their jamming pattern for several minutes, allowing the simulated strike aircraft to approach their targets while enemy radar systems struggled to maintain tracking locks through the electromagnetic interference. Sarah found herself settling into the familiar rhythm of electronic warfare operations, monitoring multiple systems simultaneously while maintaining formation position and scanning for threats. Magic Viper flight, showing multiple airborne contacts. Approaching from the northeast, request picture. Davidson called to the AWACS controller, seeking information about the aircraft that radar was detecting in their vicinity. Viper flight, Magic, contact bear 045 at 15 miles, low altitude. Appears to be 4 ship of F-16s in tactical spread, probably your opposition force for today's scenario. The opposing F-16s materialized from the desert haze like phantoms, their camouflage paint schemes making them nearly invisible against the mottled brown landscape until they were close enough for Sarah to distinguish individual aircraft details. Captain Lisa Cobra Freeman led the aggressor formation with the kind of predatory precision that had made her one of the most respected opposition pilots at Nellis. Her aircraft bore the distinctive desert camouflage and foreign markings that identified her as representing enemy forces in the day's training scenario. Sarah watched Freeman's formation execute a textbook intercept maneuver, positioning themselves to attack the jamming aircraft from multiple directions simultaneously. The aggressor pilots were masters of their craft, trained to replicate the tactics and capabilities of actual adversary air forces with deadly accuracy. Their mission was to prevent Viper flight from completing their electronic warfare objectives, using any means necessary within the established rules of engagement. Viper flight, bandits 12 o'clock, 4 miles, coming hot, Davidson announced, his voice maintaining the calm professionalism that distinguished experienced combat pilots from those who allowed adrenaline to affect their decision-making. The approaching aircraft were clearly maneuvering for an attack run that would test every aspect of Viper flight's defensive capabilities. Harrison's aircraft suddenly broke formation without warning, pulling into a steep climbing turn that positioned him for what appeared to be an aggressive counterattack against the lead aggressor aircraft. His maneuver violated standard defensive protocols and left Sarah temporarily without the mutual support that formation flying was designed to provide in hostile environments. Viper 3, maintain formation discipline, Davidson commanded sharply, recognizing that Harrison's freelance maneuvering could compromise the entire flight's defensive posture. Electronic warfare missions required tight coordination between all aircraft, and individual heroics often resulted in mission failure rather than tactical success. But Harrison's radio remained silent as he continued his unauthorized attack run, apparently convinced that his superior flying skills would allow him to engage the aggressor aircraft successfully despite being outnumbered and out of position. Sarah found herself in the vulnerable position of maintaining jamming operations while her designated formation partner pursued his own tactical agenda. Freeman's aggressor flight responded to Harrison's attack with practiced efficiency. 1 aircraft, engaging him directly while the other 3 continued their approach toward the remaining jamming aircraft. Sarah realized that Harrison's impulsive maneuvering had actually made their mission more difficult by reducing their defensive firepower and breaking the mutual support that formation flying provided. Viper 4 continued jamming operations. "I'll handle the intercept," Davidson instructed, pulling his F-16 into a defensive position that would shield Sarah's aircraft from the approaching aggressors. Rodriguez moved to support Davidson, leaving Sarah to maintain her electronic warfare mission while the rest of the formation engaged in air-to-air combat. The LQ-131 jamming pod required constant attention to remain effective against the simulated surface-to-air missile sites below, but Sarah found herself dividing her attention between equipment management and the developing air combat situation around her. She could see tracer rounds from the aggressor aircraft streaking past Davidson's F-16 as he maneuvered to avoid simulated missile shots. Through her headset, Sarah could hear the rapid radio communications that characterized air combat operations. "Fox 2, Fox 2, Davidson called, indicating that he had fired simulated air-to-air missiles at one of the attacking aircraft. The sophisticated training systems at Nellis could calculate whether such shots would have been successful in actual combat, providing realistic feedback about pilot performance and tactical effectiveness. "Viper lead, you're defensive, bandit on your 6 o'clock, 2 miles, Rodriguez warned, his voice tight with concentration as he tried to position himself to assist Davidson while maintaining his own defensive posture. The aggressor pilots were clearly experienced in multiple aircraft engagement scenarios, coordinating their attacks to maximize pressure on the defending formation. Sarah maintained her jamming mission with mechanical precision despite the chaos erupting around her, but she noticed something troubling in her equipment readings. The jamming pod's power output was fluctuating slightly, indicating a potential problem with the system's internal components. Such malfunctions were not uncommon with complex electronic equipment, but they could significantly reduce mission effectiveness if not addressed promptly. A quick diagnostic check revealed that one of the pod's transmitter modules was operating at reduced power, likely due to overheating in the high-altitude environment. Sarah began adjusting her jamming parameters to compensate for the reduced capability, redistributing power among the remaining functional modules to maintain coverage of the most critical radar frequencies. "Viper 4, how's your jamming effectiveness?" Davidson asked during a brief lull in the air combat maneuvering around him. His question indicated that he was monitoring the overall mission success, even while engaged in defensive combat operations. "Experiencing some degradation in the J-band coverage, but maintaining adequate suppression on priority targets," Sarah reported, using the technical language that conveyed both the problem and her solution without alarming other flight members. Her ability to adapt to equipment failures while maintaining mission focus was exactly the kind of competence that distinguished professional aviators from those who panicked when systems didn't perform as expected. Freeman's aggressor aircraft suddenly appeared in Sarah's peripheral vision, having disengaged from the main air combat to focus specifically on the jamming aircraft. The enemy pilot's tactics were sound, recognizing that destroying the electronic warfare platform would allow the simulated surface-to-air missiles to engage the strike package effectively. "Viper 4, bandit 3 o'clock, 1 mile, coming around." "For a shot," Rodriguez warned, though his own defensive maneuvering prevented him from providing immediate assistance. Sarah found herself alone against an experienced aggressor pilot while simultaneously managing a malfunctioning jamming system and maintaining formation position. Freeman's F-16 pulled into firing position with the fluid grace of someone who had performed similar maneuvers thousands of times in training and combat. Sarah could see the aggressor pilot's helmet turning to track her aircraft as Freeman lined up for what would likely be a successful simulated missile shot if Sarah didn't take immediate defensive action, instead of the expected panic or hesitation that might characterize an inexperienced pilot facing such a situation. Sarah's response was swift and precisely calculated. She pulled her F-16 into a descending spiral that used the aircraft's energy state and position relative to the terrain to maximum advantage, creating a defensive geometry that would make Freeman's shot significantly more difficult. The maneuver was more sophisticated than standard undergraduate pilot training typically produced, requiring an understanding of energy management and spatial relationships that usually came from extensive combat experience. Sarah's aircraft descended rapidly while maintaining just enough forward speed to avoid stalling, creating a three-dimensional puzzle that challenged Freeman's ability to achieve a successful firing solution. Freeman's radio crackled with what sounded like surprised acknowledgement of Sarah's defensive maneuvering. "Nice move, Viper 4, the aggressor pilot transmitted, her voice carrying professional respect for a well-executed defensive maneuver. The comment was unusual during training exercises, where opposing pilots typically maintained strict radio discipline. Sarah's defensive spiral brought her aircraft dangerously close to the mountainous terrain that bordered the training area. But she maintained precise control throughout the maneuver, while simultaneously working to restore full power to her jamming equipment. Her hands moved across the cockpit controls with practiced efficiency, managing multiple systems under high-stress conditions. The jamming pod's diagnostic systems indicated that the overheating problem was resolving as the aircraft descended to lower altitude, where atmospheric conditions were more favorable for electronic equipment operation. Sarah began bringing her systems back to full power while pulling out of her defensive dive at precisely the altitude that maximized her separation from Freeman's pursuing aircraft. How did she know to do that? Harrison's voice came through the radio, apparently having witnessed Sarah's defensive maneuvering while engaged in his own combat with the aggressor formation. His tone carried genuine surprise rather than the condescending skepticism that usually characterized his comments about her flying. Davidson's response was immediate and pointed. "Viper 3, maintain radio discipline and focus on your own engagement." But Sarah caught something in the squadron commander's voice that suggested Harrison wasn't the only pilot surprised by her performance under pressure. Freeman's aggressor aircraft had lost its advantageous position during Sarah's defensive maneuvering and was now forced to maneuver defensively as Rodriguez positioned himself for a counterattack. The air combat situation had shifted dramatically within seconds, demonstrating how quickly tactical advantages could change in multi-aircraft engagements. "Viper 4, resume jamming operations. You're clear of immediate threats," Davidson instructed, indicating that the air combat phase of the mission was concluding successfully. Sarah reactivated her electronic warfare systems at full power, noting that all equipment was now functioning within normal parameters. The simulated surface-to-air missile sites below were showing clear signs of radar degradation as her jamming signals reached full effectiveness. The strike package aircraft were approaching their targets under the protective umbrella of electronic interference that made their successful attack possible. "Magic Viper flight, mission successful, RTB when ready," Davidson reported to the AWACS controller, using the standard terminology that indicated their objectives had been accomplished, and they were prepared to return to base. The entire engagement had lasted less than 15 minutes, but Sarah felt as though she had compressed hours of experience into that brief period. As the formation began its transit back toward Nellis, Sarah noticed that Harrison's aircraft had moved closer to her position than standard formation procedures required. Through his cockpit canopy, she could see him studying her aircraft and flying technique with obvious curiosity rather than the dismissive attitude he had displayed earlier. "Viper 4, Harrison's voice came through the radio privately, using a discrete frequency that wouldn't be heard by the other flight members. "Where did you learn to fly defensive maneuvers like that?" The question hung in the air between them, carrying implications that went beyond simple curiosity about pilot training. Sarah's performance during the engagement had clearly exceeded Harrison's expectations. forcing him to reconsider his assumptions about her background and capabilities. "Standard pilot training, Viper 3, she replied neutrally, maintaining the fiction of her official personnel record, despite the growing evidence that her skills transcended anything that undergraduate pilot training typically produced. Her defensive maneuvering and equipment management under pressure had revealed competencies that usually required years of specialized experience to develop. Harrison's silence on the radio suggested that he found her explanation less than convincing. But the formation frequency wasn't an appropriate place for detailed discussions about pilot backgrounds or training histories. The questions would likely resurface during the post-mission debrief, when there would be opportunity for more detailed analysis of the day's events. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this content, please subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss our latest videos. The flight back to Nellis proceeded smoothly, with all 4 aircraft maintaining proper formation discipline while transitioning from the training environment back to normal air traffic control procedures. Sarah used the relatively peaceful transit time to conduct post-mission analysis of her equipment performance, noting the circumstances that had caused the temporary jamming pod malfunction and the corrective actions that had restored full capability. The brief room at Nellis buzzed with the controlled energy that followed every red flag mission, pilots reviewing video footage and data recordings that would dissect every aspect of their performance with surgical precision. Sarah entered the room to find the other members of Viper Flight already seated around the large conference table, their flight suits still damp with perspiration from the high-stress maneuvering they had just completed. The walls displayed multiple screens showing radar tracks, communication transcripts, and weapon system data that would form the basis of their tactical analysis. Major Davidson stood at the front of the room, reviewing printed reports that summarized the mission's electronic warfare effectiveness and air-to-air engagement results. His expression was professionally neutral, though Sarah noticed him glancing in her direction with what appeared to be thoughtful consideration rather than the routine evaluation he typically applied to training mission debriefs. "Gentlemen and lady," Davidson began, using the formal address that established the serious tone required for effective mission analysis. "Today's red flag exercise provided several learning opportunities that we need to discuss thoroughly. The electronic warfare mission was ultimately successful, but there were tactical decisions that merit detailed examination." Captain Freeman entered the room accompanied by 2 other aggressor pilots, their presence indicating that the debrief would include the opposing perspective that made red flag exercises valuable learning experiences. Freeman's desert camouflage flight suit bore patches from foreign air forces, part of the carefully maintained fiction that aggressor squadrons represented actual enemy capabilities rather than American pilots, role-playing adversary tactics. "Captain Freeman," Davidson acknowledged, "your flight's intercept of our jamming formation was executed exactly according to current enemy doctrine. I'm particularly interested in your assessment of our defensive responses and electronic warfare effectiveness." Freeman consulted her own notes before responding, her voice carrying the professional respect that characterized interactions between opposing pilots after training engagements. "Major Davidson, your formation's jamming was highly effective against the simulated SAM sites. However, I was surprised by the defensive maneuvering displayed by your number 4 aircraft when I attempted to engage her directly." Sarah felt the attention of everyone in the room focus on her as Freeman continued her assessment. The aggressor pilot's comments were clearly leading toward detailed analysis of the defensive spiral that had disrupted what should have been a successful attack run by an experienced opposition pilot. The maneuver she executed was more sophisticated than we typically see from pilots at her experience level, Freeman added, her tone suggesting genuine curiosity about Sarah's background rather than criticism of her performance. It demonstrated an understanding of energy management and 3-dimensional tactics that usually requires extensive air combat experience to develop. Harrison leaned forward in his chair, his expression reflecting the same questions that had prompted his private RADIO communication during the flight back to base. Captain Mitchell, where exactly did you learn those defensive techniques? That wasn't standard BFM from undergraduate pilot training. The question hung in the room's air conditioning hum, creating a moment of silence that seemed to stretch longer than it actually lasted. Sarah felt multiple sets of eyes evaluating her response, recognizing that her answer would either deflect further inquiry or intensify the growing curiosity about her background and training history. I've always been interested in studying historical air combat tactics, she replied carefully, choosing words that were technically truthful while avoiding specific details about her experience. The Air Force has excellent publications on energy management and defensive maneuvering that I've spent considerable time reviewing. Davidson's expression suggested he found her explanation plausible but incomplete, though he chose not to pursue the matter further in front of the mixed group of pilots. Rodriguez nodded approvingly, apparently satisfied that intellectual curiosity could explain advanced tactical knowledge, while Harrison's skeptical expression indicated he remained unconvinced. Regardless of where the knowledge came from, Freeman interjected diplomatically, the execution was flawless under pressure. That kind of performance indicates both theoretical understanding and practical application that deserves recognition. The formal debrief continued with detailed analysis of communication procedures, weapon employment, and formation discipline throughout the mission. Sarah contributed to the discussion when directly questioned, but maintained her strategy of avoiding comments that might draw additional attention to her performance or background. As the session concluded and pilots began gathering their materials, Lieutenant Colonel Williams entered the room with an expression that immediately captured everyone's attention. The squadron commander's presence during routine debriefs was unusual, typically reserved for missions that had produced significant learning points or operational concerns, requiring senior leadership involvement. Major Davidson, I need to speak with you and Captain Mitchell privately, Williams announced, his tone indicating that the conversation would involve matters beyond standard training evaluation. The other pilots filed out of the room, their curious glances suggesting they recognized the unusual nature of the request. Williams waited until the room was empty before closing the door and activating the secure communication system that prevented electronic eavesdropping. The precautions seemed excessive for a training mission debrief, creating an atmosphere of importance that made Sarah increasingly uncomfortable about the direction their conversation might take. Captain Mitchell, Williams began, consulting a classified folder that he had been carrying. I've received some interesting reports about your performance today, both from our own pilots and from the aggressor squadron leadership. Sarah maintained her neutral expression despite growing internal concern about where this discussion was leading. Williams' access to classified information about her background had been obvious since her assignment to Nellis, but she had hoped to maintain her cover identity throughout her tour at the squadron. Sir, I simply executed standard defensive procedures when engaged by the opposition aircraft, she replied, using the same explanation she had offered during the formal debrief session. Nothing beyond what any pilot should be capable of performing under similar circumstances. Williams opened the folder and extracted several photographs that he placed on the conference room table. Sarah recognized them immediately as surveillance images from her previous classified assignments, including operations that were supposed to remain buried in restricted access files permanently. Captain Alexandra Phoenix Chun, Williams said quietly, using the name and call sign that had been officially erased from military records 7 years earlier. Former test pilot for the 412th Test Wing at Edwards Air Force Base, specialized in experimental aircraft evaluation under extreme weather conditions. The photograph showed her in the cockpit of aircraft that didn't exist in any public documentation, including prototypes that had been developed for operations in atmospheric conditions that would ground conventional fighters. Sarah's carefully maintained cover identity was dissolving before her eyes as Williams revealed knowledge that only a handful of people in the entire Air Force possessed. "Sir, I believe there's been some mistake in your records," she attempted, though the futility of maintaining her deception was obvious given the detailed intelligence Williams clearly possessed about her true background. Davidson's expression showed growing comprehension as he processed the implications of Williams' revelation. "Colonel, are you saying that Captain Mitchell has been operating under an assumed identity? That she's actually a test pilot with classified experience?" Williams nodded grimly. "Captain Chun was involved in a classified program that tested fighter aircraft capabilities under extreme weather conditions, including hurricane-force winds and severe turbulence that would be impossible to replicate in normal flight testing. Her official records were sealed after a testing accident that was blamed on pilot error rather than equipment failure." Sarah felt the familiar anger rising as Williams referenced the incident that had ended her test pilot career and forced her into hiding under an assumed identity. The accident had killed her test partner and destroyed a prototype aircraft worth hundreds of millions of dollars, but the official investigation had ignored equipment malfunctions in favor of blaming pilot judgment. "The investigation was flawed," she said quietly, speaking the truth for the first time in years about events that had haunted her throughout her exile at Nellis. The aircraft had known control system problems that weren't addressed because of schedule, pressure, and budget constraints. Williams closed the folder and fixed her with a steady gaze that conveyed both understanding and determination. "Captain Chun, I've reviewed the classified investigation files. I know the accident wasn't your fault, and I know why you accepted responsibility to protect the test program." The room fell silent as the full implications of Sarah's true identity settled among the three officers. Her assignment to Nellis hadn't been random rotation of training personnel, but a carefully orchestrated placement that kept her available for situations that might require her unique expertise. "Sir," Sarah said carefully, "why are you revealing this information now?" "My assignment here was supposed to maintain operational security indefinitely." Williams stood and walked to the secure communication terminal, initiating a connection that would link them to higher headquarters. "Because Hurricane Delilah has intensified to Category 4 strength and changed course. It's now tracking directly toward the Gulf Coast, and we have a developing situation that requires your specific skill set." The secure terminal screen activated, showing weather satellite imagery of a massive storm system that had grown far beyond the predictions offered during that morning's briefing. Hurricane Delilah had become a monster, with sustained winds exceeding 140 miles per hour and a storm surge that threatened to devastate everything in its path. "Captain Chun," Williams continued, "there's an F-16 pilot missing in the storm system." Lieutenant Sarah Rodriguez from the 149th Fighter Wing, Texas Air National Guard, was conducting a routine training mission when Delilah's rapid intensification caught her aircraft in conditions that exceed normal flight envelope limitations. Sarah studied the weather imagery with professional interest, recognizing wind patterns and atmospheric disturbances that represented extreme danger for any aircraft caught within the storm's circulation. Hurricane flying was one of the most dangerous missions in military aviation, requiring specialized training and equipment that most pilots never received. "Sir, standard search and rescue procedures should handle pilot recovery once the storm passes," she offered, though she suspected Williams wouldn't have revealed her identity for a routine SAR mission. "Lieutenant Rodriguez is flying an F-16 with experimental fly-by-wire modifications," Williams explained, displaying technical specifications that showed aircraft systems Sarah recognized from her test pilot days. The modifications were designed to improve handling characteristics, but they create control problems in severe turbulence that only someone with your background would understand. Davidson leaned forward, beginning to comprehend the unique nature of the situation they were facing. Colonel, are you suggesting that Captain Chien is the only pilot qualified to attempt a rescue in hurricane conditions? Williams nodded gravely. The experimental modifications on Rodriguez's aircraft make it virtually unflyable in severe weather unless the pilot understands exactly how to compensate for the control system anomalies. Captain Chun tested similar systems under comparable conditions. Sarah felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders as she realized that her carefully hidden past was about to collide with a life-or-death emergency that only she was qualified to handle. The pilot training that had brought her to this moment was about to be tested under conditions that would challenge every skill she had developed during her years as a test pilot. The secure communications terminal displayed real-time weather data from Hurricane Delilah that made Sarah's breath catch in her throat. Wind speeds had reached 155 miles per hour, with gusts exceeding 180, creating atmospheric conditions that would tear apart most aircraft attempting to penetrate the storms. Circulation. The eye wall extended from sea level to over 50,000 feet, a vertical column of destruction that represented the most violent weather phenomenon on Earth. Lieutenant Rodriguez's last known position was here, Williams said, pointing to a coordinate display that showed her aircraft approximately 40 miles northeast of the storm's center. She was conducting a routine proficiency flight when Delilah's rapid intensification trapped her inside the circulation pattern. Her aircraft's experimental fly-by-wire system began malfunctioning as soon as she encountered severe turbulence. Sarah studied the flight path data with growing concern, recognizing the signature of control system failures she had experienced during her own testing of similar aircraft modifications. The experimental systems were designed to improve handling characteristics under normal conditions, but they became dangerously unpredictable when subjected to the extreme forces generated by hurricane-strength winds and turbulence. What's her current fuel state? Sarah asked, already calculating the time constraints that would govern any rescue attempt. F-16 aircraft had limited endurance under the best conditions, and fighting hurricane winds would consume fuel at an accelerated rate that could leave Rodriguez with insufficient reserves to reach safe landing areas. Approximately 90 minutes of fuel remaining based on her last transmission, Williams replied, consulting communication logs that showed increasingly desperate radio calls from the trapped pilot. She's been trying to escape the storm circulation for over an hour, but the experimental flight controls are preventing normal maneuvering. Davidson stood and walked to the weather display, his expression reflecting the tactical assessment of a combat veteran evaluating an extremely dangerous mission. Colonel, with all due respect, sending anyone into those conditions would be tantamount to ordering a suicide mission. No aircraft can survive that kind of turbulence and wind shear. Sarah found herself studying the storm structure with the analytical focus that had characterized her approach to test flying, looking for patterns and possibilities that might not be obvious to pilots without hurricane penetration experience. The eye wall's vertical development showed areas of relative stability that could provide temporary refuge for aircraft caught within the storm circulation. Sir, has anyone attempted to contact Lieutenant Rodriguez with specific instructions for managing the control system anomalies? She asked, recognizing that pilot technique could partially compensate for the aircraft's design flaws under extreme conditions. Williams shook his head grimly. She's been advised to attempt normal storm escape procedures, but those techniques don't account for the experimental system's behavioral quirks. The flight control computers are interpreting turbulence inputs as pilot commands, creating oscillations that make the aircraft nearly uncontrollable. The technical problem was familiar to Sarah from her test pilot days, when she had encountered similar issues during evaluation of prototype flight control systems. The experimental computers were too sensitive to atmospheric disturbances, amplifying rather than dampening the effects of turbulence in ways that could quickly exceed a pilot's ability to maintain control. "I need to see the specific modifications made to her aircraft," Sarah said, moving to the secure terminal to access technical specifications that would reveal exactly how the experimental systems differed from standard F-16 configurations. Her hands moved across the keyboard with practiced efficiency, navigating through classified databases that contained detailed engineering drawings and test reports. The modifications were more extensive than she had expected, involving not just flight control software, but also structural changes to the aircraft's control surfaces and hydraulic systems. The alterations were designed to improve performance in air-to-air combat scenarios, but they created handling characteristics that would be problematic even under normal weather conditions. "These modifications are based on the Phase 3 program I was testing at Edwards," Sarah realized, recognizing design elements from the experimental aircraft that had killed her test partner years earlier. "The control system has a tendency to over-respond to pilot inputs when it encounters unexpected atmospheric conditions." Williams leaned over her shoulder to examine the technical specifications, his expression showing growing understanding of the unique challenges that Lieutenant Rodriguez was facing. "Can the problems be corrected from the cockpit, or would she need ground-based technical support to modify the system behavior?" Sarah traced through the aircraft's control logic diagrams, identifying the specific software parameters that were causing the dangerous oscillations. "There's a manual override procedure that can partially disable the experimental functions, but it requires a specific sequence of switch positions and throttle inputs that most pilots wouldn't know." The override procedure was buried deep in classified test documentation that had never been incorporated into standard pilot training or emergency procedures. Sarah had learned it through painful experience during her own testing of similar systems, knowledge that had been purchased with the life of her test partner. "Can you talk her through the procedure over radio?" Davidson asked, though his expression suggested he already understood the limitations of trying to provide complex technical instructions to a pilot fighting for control in hurricane conditions. "The communication requirements would be too complex," Sarah replied, still studying the aircraft specifications. "The override sequence involves precise timing and throttle coordination that can't be effectively communicated through radio instructions." During severe turbulence, Williams walked to the secure phone that connected directly to Air Combat Command headquarters, his expression indicating that he was preparing to seek authorization for an unprecedented rescue mission. "Captain Chun, would you be able to fly formation with Lieutenant Rodriguez and physically guide her through the override procedure?" The question hung in the air like an unexploded bomb, its implications rippling through the room as all three officers contemplated the extraordinary nature of what Williams was proposing. Flying formation in hurricane conditions was theoretically impossible, requiring aircraft to maintain precise relative positions while both were being battered by winds that exceeded the design limits of military fighters. "Sir, formation flying in those conditions would require aircraft-to-aircraft visual contact in weather that has essentially zero visibility," Sarah pointed out, though she was already analyzing the technical requirements that would make such a mission theoretically possible. "The storm's eye provides a pocket of relative calm," Williams replied, displaying satellite imagery that showed the characteristic clear area at the center of Hurricane Delilah's circulation. "If you could reach Lieutenant Rodriguez while she's transiting through the eye, there might be a window of opportunity for formation flying." Sarah studied the eye's dimensions and movement patterns, calculating the timing that would be required to intercept Rodriguez's aircraft during its passage through the storm's center. The eye was approximately 20 miles in diameter, providing a temporary sanctuary where aircraft could operate in relatively calm conditions. "The approach would have to be precisely timed," she said, her mind automatically shifting into the mission planning mode that had characterized her test pilot career. I'd need to penetrate the eye wall at exactly the right moment to intercept her aircraft, then guide her through the override procedure before the eye passes. Davidson's expression showed growing alarm as he processed the tactical requirements of such a mission. Captain, you're talking about deliberately flying into the most dangerous weather phenomenon on the planet, with no backup plan if something goes wrong. Sarah turned away from the technical displays to face both senior officers, feeling the weight of decision that would define not just her own future, but potentially save another pilot's life. The mission represented everything she had trained for during her years as a test pilot, the kind of extreme weather operation that existed at the very edge of what aircraft and human skill could accomplish. Sir, I need to know exactly what aircraft would be available for this mission, she said, her tone indicating that she had already made her decision despite the enormous risks involved. Standard F-16s won't have the performance characteristics necessary for hurricane penetration. Williams opened another classified folder, revealing specifications for aircraft that didn't appear in a public documentation. We have access to an F-16 configured with the experimental weather radar and reinforced structure that you tested during the Phase 4 program. It's the only aircraft currently available that was designed for extreme weather operations. The aircraft he described was familiar to Sarah as one of the prototypes she had helped develop during her classified test program, incorporating structural modifications and specialized equipment that allowed limited operations in weather conditions that would destroy normal fighters. Flying it would be like stepping back into her former life as Captain Alexandra Chun. The aircraft is maintained in flyable condition at a classified facility approximately 2 hours from here, Williams continued. If you accept this mission, transportation can be arranged immediately. Sarah looked at the weather imagery showing Hurricane Delilah's continued intensification, knowing that every minute of delay reduced Lieutenant Rodriguez's chances of survival. The trapped pilot was burning fuel while fighting control system malfunctions in conditions that were deteriorating rapidly as the storm continued to strengthen. I'll need current weather reconnaissance data and real-time communication with Lieutenant Rodriguez to coordinate the intercept, she said, her voice carrying the calm authority that had once made her one of the Air Force's most effective test pilots. This mission will require precision timing that doesn't allow for errors or equipment failures. Williams reached for the secure phone, preparing to initiate the authorization process that would officially activate Captain Alexandra Sheen for her first operational mission in 7 years. Captain, you understand that this operation exists outside normal command authority. If something goes wrong, there will be no official support or recognition. Sarah nodded, understanding that she was about to step back into the shadows where her most important work had always been conducted. Sir, there's a pilot in trouble who needs help that only I can provide. That's all the authorization I need. The secure phone connected to Air Combat Command Headquarters, beginning the process that would either save Lieutenant Rodriguez's life or add another tragedy to the growing list of Hurricane Delilah's victims. Sarah felt the familiar calm of pre-mission focus settling over her as she prepared to fly once again into conditions that existed at the very limits of human capability and aircraft performance. Hurricane Delilah was about to face the one pilot who possessed both the skills and determination necessary to penetrate its defenses and extract the fellow aviator from the storm's deadly embrace. The classified hangar at Groom Lake sat hidden beneath camouflage netting that rendered it invisible to satellite surveillance, housing aircraft that officially didn't exist in any Air Force inventory. Sarah stood before the F-16XW, a prototype fighter that bore only superficial resemblance to standard fighting Falcons despite sharing the same basic airframe designation. The aircraft's reinforced structure incorporated titanium, longerons designed to withstand stress loads that would snap conventional fighters in half, while its modified wing design featured adaptive surfaces that could adjust their camber in Response to extreme atmospheric conditions. Colonel Williams walked alongside her as she conducted her pre-flight inspection, his expression reflecting the gravity of authorizing a mission that existed completely outside normal military protocols. The hangar's security personnel wore no unit insignia or name tags, their anonymity reflecting the classified nature of operations conducted at this facility, where experimental aircraft pushed the boundaries of aeronautical engineering. The aircraft's weather radar has been upgraded with penetration capabilities specifically designed for hurricane operations, Williams explained, pointing to the bulbous nose cone that housed equipment far more sophisticated than anything installed on production fighters. It can map wind patterns and locate areas of relative stability within storm systems that would be invisible to conventional radar. Sarah examined the radar installation with professional interest, recognizing technology she had helped develop. During her test pilot career, when evaluating aircraft performance under extreme weather conditions, the system represented years of classified research into atmospheric dynamics and their effects on high performance aircraft operating in conditions that exceeded normal flight envelopes. The aircraft's cockpit had been modified with additional displays and controls that would allow single pilot management of complex weather penetration systems while simultaneously flying precision intercept profiles. Sarah settled into the ejection seat that had been custom fitted for her physical dimensions, her hands automatically finding familiar switch positions despite the years that had passed since her last flight in similar experimental aircraft. Captain Chun, Williams said, using her real name for the first time since revealing her true identity. Lieutenant Rodriguez's fuel state has dropped to approximately 60 minutes remaining. The intercept window is narrowing rapidly. Sarah acknowledged the time pressure while continuing her systematic cockpit preparation, configuring navigation systems for the precise approach vectors that would allow her to penetrate Hurricane Delilah's eye wall at exactly the right moment to intercept the trapped pilot. The mission required split-second timing coordinated with weather patterns that were constantly evolving as the storm continued to intensify. The F-16XW's engine spooled up with a distinctive harmonic that differentiated them from standard power plants, their enhanced performance reflecting modifications designed to operate in atmospheric conditions that would flame out conventional turbofan engines. Sarah monitored temperature and pressure readings that confirmed all systems were functioning within experimental parameters as she prepared for the most dangerous flight of her career. "Phoenix, this is Darkstar Control," came the radio call. That officially activated her former call sign for the first time in 7 years. Weather Reconnaissance Aircraft Report. Hurricane Delilah's eye wall extends to 52,000 feet with sustained winds of 160 miles per hour. Storm Center is tracking northwest at 12 miles per hour. Sarah acknowledged the weather update while calculating intercept courses that would position her aircraft to penetrate the storm system during Lieutenant Rodriguez's projected passage through the eye. The timing had to be perfect, requiring her to arrive in the storm center within a narrow window when both aircraft would be in the same location simultaneously. The takeoff from Groom Lake proceeded smoothly despite the experimental aircraft's unusual handling characteristics, its reinforced structure and modified aerodynamics, creating flight dynamics that required constant pilot attention to maintain stable flight. Sarah climbed rapidly toward her assigned altitude, knowing that every minute of delay reduced the chances of reaching Lieutenant Rodriguez before her fuel ran out. "Phoenix, Darkstar Control, we're receiving intermittent radio transmissions from Viper 77, the controller reported, using Lieutenant Rodriguez's call sign. "She's reporting severe control oscillations and difficulty maintaining altitude. Estimated fuel remaining is now 45 minutes. Sarah pushed her aircraft to maximum cruise speed, the F-16XW responding with acceleration that exceeded anything she had experienced in standard fighters. The experimental engines and aerodynamic modifications allowed sustained flight, speeds that would be impossible for production aircraft. Though the performance came at the cost of dramatically increased fuel consumption, the first wisps of Hurricane Delilah's outer circulation bands appeared on her weather radar as towering columns of atmospheric disturbance that extended far beyond normal cloud tops. Sarah began configuring her penetration systems for the systematic approach that would carry her through increasingly violent weather conditions toward the storm's center where Lieutenant Rodriguez was trapped. Dark Star Control Phoenix, beginning. Storm penetration in 30 seconds, she reported, her voice maintaining professional calm despite the knowledge that she was about to fly deliberately into weather conditions that had destroyed aircraft and killed pilots throughout aviation history. The storm's outer band struck her aircraft with sudden violence that tested every structural modification incorporated into the F-16XW's design. Turbulence beyond anything experienced in normal flight threw the aircraft through attitude changes that would have been impossible to control without the experimental flight systems that automatically compensated for atmospheric forces exceeding human reaction times. Sarah's hands gripped the control stick with practiced firmness as she flew deeper into Hurricane Delilah's circulation, following instrument readings that guided her toward the storm's eye where Lieutenant Rodriguez waited for rescue that only one pilot in the Air Force possessed the skills and equipment to provide. The F-16XW plunged into Hurricane Delilah's eye wall like a missile penetrating the gates of hell. The aircraft's reinforced structure, groaning under atmospheric forces that peaked at over 12 times normal gravitational loading. Sarah fought to maintain control as the experimental fighter was hammered by wind shears that changed direction and intensity within microseconds, creating flight conditions that pushed both human endurance and aircraft capability beyond their theoretical limits. Phoenix, I have you on radar penetrating the northern eye wall, Dark Star Control reported, their voice crackling through static created by the storm's electromagnetic interference. Viper 77 is approximately 8 miles southeast of your position, altitude 15,000 feet, still experiencing severe control oscillations. Sarah's weather radar painted a picture of atmospheric chaos surrounding a pocket of relative calm at the storm's center, the eye appearing as a cylinder of clear air approximately 18 miles in diameter. Lieutenant Rodriguez's aircraft appeared as a faint contact, moving erratically within the eye's boundaries, her flight path showing the distinctive oscillations that indicated ongoing battle with malfunctioning flight controls. The transition from eye wall turbulence to the storm's center was as sudden as stepping from a battlefield into a cathedral, the violent buffeting replaced by an eerie calm that felt almost supernatural after the punishment Sarah had endured during penetration. Sunlight streamed down through the eye's opening 40,000 feet above, illuminating cloud walls that rose vertically like the interior of a massive atmospheric amphitheater. Viper 77 Phoenix, how do you hear? Sarah transmitted on the emergency frequency, scanning visually for Lieutenant Rodriguez's aircraft, while simultaneously configuring her systems for the precise formation flying that would be required to guide the trapped pilot through the control system override. Procedure. Phoenix, Viper 77, thank God someone's here, came the immediate response, Rodriguez's voice tight with stress and approaching desperation. My aircraft is almost uncontrollable. The flight computers are fighting every input I make, and I'm burning fuel at an accelerated rate, trying to maintain level flight. Sarah spotted Rodriguez's F-16 approximately 2 miles away, the aircraft's erratic flight path clearly visible as it struggled against control inputs that were being amplified and distorted by the experimental flight systems. The trapped pilot was fighting a losing battle against computers that were misinterpreting atmospheric disturbances as intentional control movements, creating oscillations that would eventually exceed the aircraft's structural limits. Viper 77, I'm going to join on your aircraft and talk you through a manual override procedure, Sarah transmitted while positioning her F-16XW for the delicate approach that would bring her into close formation with an aircraft that was behaving unpredictably. The procedure will require precise throttle and switch coordination, but it should restore normal flight characteristics. Rodriguez's aircraft continued its erratic movements as Sarah closed the distance between them. Each course correction revealing the extent of the control system malfunctions that were making normal flying impossible. The experimental modifications were creating feedback loops that amplified every atmospheric disturbance into control surface movements that fought against the pilot's intentions. "Phoenix, my fuel gauge shows 28 minutes remaining," Rodriguez reported, her voice reflecting the growing panic of a pilot who understood that time was running out for any rescue attempt. "I don't think I can maintain control much longer. These oscillations are getting worse." Sarah slipped her aircraft into loose formation alongside Rodriguez's F-16, close enough to observe the other pilot's control inputs, while maintaining sufficient separation to avoid collision if the malfunctioning aircraft made sudden unexpected movements. Through her canopy, she could see Rodriguez in her cockpit, her helmet turning frequently as she struggled to maintain situational awareness while fighting unresponsive controls. "Viper 77, the first step is to disconnect the experimental flight augmentation system," Sarah instructed, beginning the complex sequence that would gradually restore manual control authority to Rodriguez's aircraft. "Locate the switch. Panel marked FCS override on your left console. Position 27. Rodriguez's aircraft continued its oscillations as she searched for the specified switch, her unfamiliarity with the experimental modifications evident in the time required to locate systems that weren't part of standard F-16 configurations. The delay consumed precious seconds, while both aircraft remained trapped within Hurricane Delilah's eye, surrounded by walls of destruction that were slowly contracting as the storm continued its evolution. "I found the switch panel," Rodriguez reported, "but there are 6 different switches here. Which specific one controls the flight augmentation system?" Sarah realized that the switch configuration on Rodriguez's aircraft might differ from the prototype she had tested, requiring visual confirmation of the correct control positions. She maneuvered her F-16XW closer to the other aircraft, close enough to read instrument panel markings through the canopy while maintaining formation position despite the continuing control oscillations. The switch marked FLCS AUG in the upper right corner of the panel, Sarah specified after confirming the control layout through visual inspection. "Move it to the OF position on my count. 3, 2, 1. Execute." Rodriguez's aircraft immediately showed signs of improved stability as the experimental flight control augmentation disengaged, though significant oscillations remained as other modified systems continued to interfere with normal flight responses. The partial success encouraged Sarah that the full override procedure would restore sufficient control authority for Rodriguez to safely exit the storm system. "That helped, but I'm still getting oscillations in the pitch axis," Rodriguez reported, her voice showing relief at the partial improvement. While acknowledging that more work remained to fully resolve the control problems, Sarah continued guiding Rodriguez through the systematic shutdown of experimental systems, each step requiring precise timing and coordination, while both aircraft maintained formation within the hurricane's eye. The procedure represented years of classified testing experience compressed into life-saving knowledge that existed nowhere in official documentation. As the final experimental system was disabled, Rodriguez's F-16 finally achieved stable flight characteristics that would allow normal maneuvering and navigation. The successful override had restored enough control authority for the trapped pilot to safely exit Hurricane Delilah's circulation and reach emergency landing fields beyond the storm's influence. "Phoenix, Viper 77, aircraft is responding normally now," Rodriguez transmitted, her voice filled with gratitude and amazement. "How did you know those procedures?" That's not in any manual I've ever seen. Sarah guided both aircraft toward the eye wall opening that would provide their escape route from the storm's center, calculating approach vectors that would minimize their exposure to the violent conditions surrounding Hurricane Delilah's core. The mission was succeeding, but their survival depended on successfully navigating back through the same atmospheric chaos that had nearly destroyed both aircraft. The two F-16s emerged from Hurricane Delilah's eye wall battered but intact, their aircraft bearing scars from atmospheric forces that few pilots would ever experience and survive. Sarah guided Lieutenant Rodriguez toward Tyndall Air Force Base, where emergency crews were standing by to receive an aircraft that had defied every probability by surviving the storm's interior circulation. Phoenix, Tyndall Tower, we have emergency services standing by, the controller reported as both fighters entered the traffic pattern. Weather conditions are marginal but acceptable for recovery operations. Rodriguez's landing was textbook perfect despite her harrowing experience. The F-16 touching down smoothly on Tyndall's rain-soaked runway while crash and rescue vehicles followed at a discreet distance. Sarah's own landing demonstrated the precise aircraft control that had characterized her entire career, bringing the experimental F-16X debut to a stop with the practiced efficiency of someone who had tested aircraft in conditions that pushed every system beyond normal limits. The post-mission debrief revealed that Hurricane Delilah had reached Category 5 intensity while both aircraft were trapped within its circulation, with sustained winds exceeding 180 miles per hour that would have made rescue impossible using conventional aircraft and standard procedures. Sarah's specialized knowledge and experimental equipment had provided the only realistic possibility for saving Rodriguez's life. Colonel Williams arrived at Tyndall within hours, bringing official documentation that would restore Captain Alexandra Chun's true identity and reinstate her classification as an active test pilot. The successful hurricane rescue had demonstrated capabilities that the Air Force needed for future extreme weather operations, ending her 7-year exile under the assumed identity of Sergeant Olivia Reeves. "Captain Chun," he said during their private meeting, "your actions today have proven that the original investigation was flawed. The Air Force is prepared to offer you reinstatement to your former position, with full recognition of your contributions to experimental flight testing." Sarah accepted the offer, knowing that her unique skills were needed for continued development of aircraft systems that could operate in weather conditions that were becoming increasingly common as global climate patterns shifted. Her expertise in hurricane penetration techniques would prove invaluable for both military operations and civilian rescue missions. Lieutenant Rodriguez recovered completely from her ordeal, becoming an advocate for improved pilot training in experimental aircraft systems. She frequently spoke about the mysterious test pilot who had appeared from Hurricane Delilah's chaos to save her life, though classified restrictions prevented her from revealing Sarah's true identity. The squadron at Nellis learned that their princess had been one of the Air Force's most accomplished test pilots, transforming mockery into profound respect for capabilities they had never imagined. Harrison personally apologized for his dismissive attitude, acknowledging that appearances had completely deceived him. About Sarah's extraordinary background, has someone you underestimated ever completely surprised you with their hidden talents? Share your incredible stories in the comments below. If you enjoyed this tale of courage and redemption, smash that subscribe button and hit the notification bell for more amazing, true stories of heroes who prove that real strength often hides in plain sight. Remember, the next time you see someone with worn boots and a quiet demeanor, they might just be the person who could save your life when the storm hits.